The last topic we discuss in Chem 132 is nuclear chemistry. And we covered this topic for several different reasons, but probably the main one is that it's a very important topic in medicine these days. If you go into a modern hospital, a very large part of the hospital is actually what's called nuclear medicine. And in order to understand what people do with nuclear in medicine, you have to understand, first of all, what nuclear reactions are and what kind of things they can be used for. So the first thing I'm showing on this slide is what is the difference between a chemical reaction, which is what we've been studying in both 131 and 132 so far, and a nuclear reaction. If you look at the chemical reaction that I put in on this slide, it shows carbon solid, which is basically charcoal or graphite, reacting with oxygen or burning to produce CO2 gas. If you look at the carbon atom that's on the left, it has 6 protons. In the periodic table, you know that the number of the element refers to how many protons it has. And any atom that has 6 protons in it is carbon. If you look at the carbon that's connected to oxygen on the right of the equation, it's still, the nucleus has 6 protons. It's still the element carbon. So the nucleus did not change. You do not change the nucleus in a chemical reaction. What do you change? You know that the only thing you do to change the bonding or the electrons in a chemical reaction is that it is the electrons outside the nucleus that are involved. The electrons outside the nucleus in a covalent reaction form shared bonds, covalent bonds. In a redox reaction, you can transfer electrons from one substance to another, but in either one, the nucleus is not involved. It's the same on both sides. The difference in a nuclear reaction is that there are certain isotopes of carbon that can change into other elements. If you look at the distribution of elements in carbon, any sample of carbon that you get from anywhere on Earth contains 3 naturally occurring isotopes. And if you remember what isotopes are, those are the same form of, they're the same elements, so they have the same number of protons, but different numbers of neutrons. In the case of carbon, there's a carbon-12, which has 6 neutrons, carbon-13, which has 7, and carbon-14, which has 8. The isotope that I'm showing in this picture is carbon-14. In order to study nuclear chemistry, you have to separate the isotopes from each other because each one does something different. In a chemical reaction, you can consider all of the isotopes basically to do the same thing because they all have the same number of electrons and they all act the same way in chemical reactions. But in nuclear reactions, each isotope is different and you have to separate the isotopes from each other. This is a diagram of a mass spectrometer, which is how you separate isotopes. You start by making the isotopes into ions, which you just knock an electron off, and then you shoot that into a magnetic field. And what you learn in physics is that if you shoot a charged particle into a magnetic field, it will curve. The thing is, it's just like going around a corner when you're driving a car. If the particle is smaller, it will go in a tighter curve because it's able to curve faster. But if it's a heavier particle, it will make a wider curve. And so what happens is the heavy particles separate from the lighter ones, and they produce on the detector peaks on a graph. And you can tell from the peaks how much of each isotope is present by how big the peak is, and you can also tell the exact weight of each one because you can calibrate the detector by weight. So you can separate all of the isotopes that are there in a sample. So once you have the isotopes separated from each other, you can study what each one of them does individually. Of the isotopes of carbon, carbon-12 and carbon-13 are what are called stable. They don't emit any particles as they are sitting. But carbon-14 shoots out what's called radiation just sitting. You don't have to heat it or shine light on it or anything. It's a natural property of the isotope. And in the process of carbon-14 shooting out a radiation, it changes into nitrogen. So the element actually changes. The electrons then just kind of readjust themselves on the outside. But the thing is, all nuclear reactions involve radiation. And so we have to talk about what radiation is first in order to really understand what nuclear reactions are giving off. I first want to talk about, before we get into that, what is the uses of nuclear reactions in medicine, just to give you an idea of why this topic is as important as it is. Radioactive isotopes are used in medicine, of course, in cancer therapy. Everybody knows what radiation treatments are. They kill cancer cells in preference to normal cells, but there's side effects because normal cells are also affected. Sometimes radioactive isotopes are used to destroy tissue. They sometimes give patients who are hyperthyroid, which is a dangerous disease because it can stop your heart. They'll give them radioactive iodine, which is accumulated in the thyroid, and it destroys the tissue, and then they give supplements of thyroid after that. You can image all kinds of parts of the body with radioactive isotopes. One example is where you can inject the element technetium into the blood, and it accumulates in beating heart muscle, and you can watch the heart beating on a fluoroscope in real time. They can scan just about anything with radiation anymore. Everybody knows about X-rays. The bones block the X-rays, but soft tissue lets it through, so you can see the outline of the bones on X-ray film. PET scanning, we're going to talk about in more detail, but that identifies areas that are metabolizing the fastest. And there's bone scans and all kinds of things that you can image all kinds of parts of the body. The fourth thing I have down there is that all of the kinds of experiments that are done in identifying gene sequences in DNA can be done by labeling DNA with radioactive phosphate in the backbone and then using enzymes, specific enzymes, to chop up the DNA, and you run it out on a gel and you get these ladders. that are called the southern blot, and you can actually identify by looking at the sequences, is a particular baby the baby of a man by comparing their DNA. You can use it in identifying ancestry genealogies, and they have all kinds of techniques to do this. It's also used in the hospital a lot in analyzing the levels of like hormones or vitamins or other things in the blood. This is called radioimmunoassay. They have antibodies that bind to certain hormones, and you can use radioactive tracers to determine the amounts of those hormones in the blood by using that. It's about probably, I would estimate, maybe half of the assays that are done in a clinical lab are probably using radiation, and so it's used in medicine a lot. Because all nuclear reactions involve radiation, we want to talk about what it is. All radiation is made up of a stream of submicroscopic particles that are either moving in the same direction or they're moving out from a center in a sphere. And the thing is that these particles are very tiny. They're parts of atoms usually, and I want to show you what kinds of radiation there are and classify them. There are particles that you can actually weigh that are parts of atoms. They have a mass. Alpha particles, for example, are 2 protons and 2 neutrons together in a particle. A beta particle is an electron, and there are neutron radiation, are neutrons. You can weigh those, but there are also particles with no mass that are given off by nuclei, and those particles are called photons. They're particles of electromagnetic radiation that only have energy but no mass. And those particles we've already talked about when we were talking about the topic of complexes. I showed you this spectrum before, and the thing about this is that all of these wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation are very important. Obviously, visible light is very important. The thing is, in a nuclear chem, the only 2 types of radiation that you see that are related to nuclear reactions are the 2 most energetic ones, and those are gamma rays and X-rays. The ones that are of lower energy are very important. They're used for other things, but they're just simply too low in energy to be involved in nuclear reactions. But if you go into chemistry, you're going to find out that all of the wavelengths in this spectrum are used for something. So one classification of radiation is particles that have a mass and particles that don't. Another classification, though, is into whether particles have enough energy to actually cause atoms to ionize. All of the ones that are in bold here are what are called ionizing radiation. They have enough energy to actually knock electrons off of an atom. If you get into the lower wavelengths, ultraviolet and visible and things like that, those are able to make electrons jump up and down, or they're able to make bonds vibrate, they're able to make molecules rotate. But the thing is, they cannot form ions. Those are called non-ionizing. The only ones that you see in nuclear reactions are the type that are ionizing. And here I listed some of the uses of non-ionizing radiation in chemistry and medicine. But the thing is, We're only going to study ionizing radiation because that's what's involved in nuclear chemistry. But if you look at the last statement on this page, the reason why people are freaked out by ionizing radiation particularly is that you can't detect it with your senses. You can't hear it or smell it or see it, but you are being irradiated all the time in the environment, and if you can receive a large enough dose of radiation from a bomb or a nuclear power plant or something, you can receive a lethal dose of ionizing radiation in a few seconds. The thing is, what would you feel if you did that? Absolutely nothing. The thing is once you receive the dose, you will die of what's called radiation sickness in just a few days. It's about by 30 days, you'll be dead of something like uncontrolled diarrhea and immune suppression. You'll get an infection, or there's a lot of problems associated with it. So people are afraid of it. I want to talk about how people discovered what ionizing radiation does, because it's interesting. After the United States dropped the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 during World War II, that was pretty much the beginning of the nuclear age. And the thing about that was the people who were killed in the initial blast, there were a lot of them, but people also were killed outside the bomb range. They were alive after the bomb, but they got radiation sickness and died later, and there were cases of cancer from outside the range happening for years and years from the radiation that came from the bombs. The thing is, the United States in 1947 established Argonne National Lab with the mission of studying the effect of radiation on biological tissue. And Argonne did experiments for years where they irradiated animals with different doses of radiation and observed the effects, and the cancers that developed were preserved in wax, and they're in a place called the morgue at Argonne. The thing is, I worked at Argonne as a postdoc for 3 years, so I worked on some of the mouse tumors that had been generated through radiation. You can't do those experiments anymore because of the PETA, and there's a lot of laws now protecting animals, but at that time they did it, and they've gotten most of the information that they wanted to get. Now they're restricted to cell culture work, but that's also important because you can still learn a lot. What labs like Argonne and others, and big schools and things discovered is that all of the damage that's caused by ionizing radiation is caused through mutation. It's damage to DNA, and all cancer is caused by mutation. Cancer is about 600 different diseases, and there'll never be a cure for cancer because you have to treat each one of them separately. They have different types of tumors in different tissues and different blood supplies and all kinds of problems associated with them. But all cancers are caused either by activation of oncogenes. Those are genes that should be turned off in the cell, but they get turned back on. Or you can deactivate what are called tumor suppressor genes. And those are genes that keep the DNA from overexpressing. But if you remove the control, the genes will start producing too much. And so ionizing radiation causes cancer in animals and humans, The other effect is just plain cell death. If you get one double-strand break in a chromosome and the two parts of the chromosome migrate apart in the cell, that's enough to kill the cell. So the kinds of this is the kinds of damage you get from radiation. Now, because it's DNA damage, cells that reproduce the fastest are affected the most, because every time a cell divides, it has to replicate a copy of the DNA for the new cell. The thing is that cancer grows faster than anything, and so cancer is affected by radiation the most, but normal tissues are also affected. Your hair grows faster than anything in your body, and you know what happens when people get radiation treatments. Their hair falls out. Digestive tract cells reproduce very fast because when you eat, you tear them off and they have to be replaced. They're the first to go. So you get nausea and diarrhea, blood-forming cells. So from radiation, you can get leukemia and different immune problems. And so you can get serious infections and lymphomas. There's all kinds of things. And in reproductive cells, if an egg gets a mutation in it, that egg gets fertilized, it can pass it on to the offspring. And if there's a stem cell that produces sperm, if a damaged sperm fertilizes an egg, it's very possible to pass it on to the offspring also. So that's why radiation sickness has the symptoms it has. The problem with radiation treatments is that radiation can help get rid of cancer, but it also causes cancer. So people can sometimes get cancer years later from the radiation treatments that they got in the hospital. What people have discovered about the effect of radiation is, this is a graph of what the dose versus biological effect is, and the biological effect could be things like the formation of tumors or just death of animals. And there's a lot of different dose response curves for different kinds of radiation, but most of the time if you double the dose, you double the effect. The problem is in the lower dose ranges, you can't separate the effect of the radiation from the background. See, this is all done by statistics. Let's say you irradiate a population of dogs with a low dose of radiation. Now, 25% of female beagles, I think, was one of the models they used at Argonne. 25% are going to get breast cancer. It's the spontaneous rate in dogs. All mammals have a spontaneous rate of breast cancer. And if you took 100 dogs, 25 of them are going to get cancer. Now, if you took another set of 100 dogs and irradiated them and 27 of them got cancer, you don't have any idea whether the other two cases came from the radiation, because it has to be greater than the background, because it could be statistical variation. So nobody really knows in those lower ranges whether how the radiation actually damages. The thing is, you have very powerful repair mechanisms for DNA in what are called repair enzymes. These are enzymes that go up and down DNA constantly and cut out errors and put in new pieces. If you went out in the sun one time, you get so many mutations that you would have skin cancer probably going in the sun once. But you have these very, very efficient DNA repair enzymes that clip out mutations that you get from the sun and put in new pieces. So normally the sun doesn't cause any damage unless you get large doses of it, which can cause skin cancer and wrinkling and things. The idea behind it is, if you go into molecular biology as a career, there are people that study repair enzymes as a career because it's very important. So the idea behind it is if you get low doses of radiation, it might not produce any lasting damage because you have these repair enzymes, but it could also cause a huge amount of damage if one of the mutations is not repaired and causes cancer. So nobody really knows in the low dose ranges. The truth of it is, though, you're being irradiated all the time. There's cosmic rays from outer space that it's the same dose everywhere on Earth all the time, no matter where you are. Very, very low doses. And there's also uranium and thorium in the rocks under the ground where you live, and depending on where you are, you'll get a higher dose of radiation depending on how much uranium is in the place where you live. The idea, though, is that these are very, very low doses, and they usually don't cause a whole lot of problem. People don't think. What people are worried about is increasing your dose. I showed some ways you can increase your dose. You can move out to a place with more uranium. Smoking is one way because it has a huge range of all the different kinds of radioactive decays occur in smoke. It seems like tobacco plants have this really obnoxious habit of accumulating heavy metal radiation producers from the soil. If you get too many x-rays or too many medical tests, how much can you give a person? Nobody really knows. And if you live next to a power plant and there happens to be a blow up or something and you get radiation in the environment, obviously. So the thing is, people try to limit the dose, but nobody really knows how much you can get safely. You can't detect radiation with your senses, and so you have to use instruments to measure it. A Geiger counter is that big horn thing that clicks when you get closer to a radioactive element. Ionizing radiation makes ions, and every time one of the ions hits the grid in a Geiger counter, it gives off a click. So the more radiation, the faster the clicking. In a CLIN lab, there's liquid scintillation counters and gamma counters. In a liquid scintillation counter, there's a kind of a molecule called a fluor, which when a beta particle hits it, it gives off a flash of light, and the machine can measure the flashes of light, tell how much radiation there is. In a gamma counter, the fluor is in crystal, and so if you're measuring gamma rays, the crystal will give off pulses of light, and they count them. And everybody knows that radiation can cause the exposure of photographic film, even in the dark. That's how they do X-rays on film. It exposes the film and you get the black areas where the radiation hits. During our discussion, I want to talk about 4 different types of nuclear reactions. The main one that we're going to talk about is nuclear decay or emission, because this is what's mainly used in medicine. I also want to touch briefly, though, on fission, which is actually the energy source that's used in nuclear power plants that produce electricity, and also it was the energy source that was used for the atomic bombs, they call them, that were dropped on near Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The third one is nuclear fusion. This is the reaction that stars use to produce energy, to produce their heat, and this gives off way more energy than in fission. So this is the basis of what they call hydrogen bombs. These are the modern atomic bombs that are way stronger than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. These are the ones that can vaporize the whole Chicago area in one bomb. That's the type of hydrogen bombs they have now. Now, nuclear bombardment is the way you make the man-made elements that are not found in nature. All of those big elements past uranium all have to be man-made in order to be able to study them. And so we're going to talk about that reaction also, but mainly we're going to talk about decay. In order to understand decay, you have to understand the nucleus, and You know from 131 a lot of things about the nucleus, but I want to tell you one thing that you may not know. You know that the protons and neutrons are in the nucleus and that the electrons are in a cloud around the outside. Now, if the nucleus was the size of a period, though, I found a calculation that said that the atom would be about the size of half of Soldier Field three-dimensionally. An atom is an object that we cannot identify with. All an atom is basically empty space. There's one little tiny dust speck in the middle, that's the nucleus, and that has all the mass of the atom because electrons only weigh about 1/2000th of a proton or neutron. And in that huge space, there's a few little electrons that are moving around the nucleus. And that's how big it is. The thing that is amazing is I've heard about calculations that people have done that if you took all the space out of all of your atoms and you put all the particles touching, you would not be able to see it. You're not made of enough matter actually to see. The only thing you're seeing when you look at objects is the electrons moving around the nucleus refract light in a certain way so that you can actually see the thing. But people and all the objects in the universe are mainly empty space. I showed you here, I said here that the mass of the atom is in the nucleus, and proton and a neutron both weigh about what they call one atomic mass unit. Neither one of them is exactly that, but that's one. And since electrons are so light, they aren't even taken into account when you weigh an atom because they're usually negligible. You know that the atomic number in the periodic table is the number of protons in the nucleus. This is what actually makes one element different from another. Any atom that has 6 protons is carbon, and any atom that has 8 protons, for example, is oxygen. They can have different numbers of neutrons, but it's the protons that makes the element unique. So you know that what's called the mass number of an atom is the protons plus neutrons, and we already said that isotopes of an element have the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons, and so each of the isotopes weighs a different amount. No matter where you get a sample of an element on Earth, it always has exactly the same percentage of each isotope determined on a mass spectrometer. It seems like when the Earth was formed, the percentage of the isotopes got fixed. I'm showing carbon as an example. Each one of the isotopes has 6 protons, but they have different numbers of neutrons. And if you add those numbers, you get 12, 13, and 14 for the masses. And that's why they call them carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14. If you remember, you write the symbol for an isotope the way they are at the bottom of this table. You put the number of protons at the bottom, you put the number of protons plus neutrons at the top, and if you subtract top minus bottom, that gives you the number of neutrons. If you do a mass spectrometer reading for carbon, you find out that the sample is about 99% carbon 12, about 1% carbon 13, and carbon 14 is only a trace because it's the one that's radioactive. The number for the mass that they put in the periodic table that you use for molar masses is actually not the weight of any particular isotope. It's what's called a weighted average of all the isotopes. So they give more weight to the most abundant isotope. And so the reason why carbon is not exactly 12, which would be what it was if it was all carbon 12, there's a small amount of carbon 13, and that skews the weight above 12. In chemical reactions, you use the average of the isotopes because they all do the same thing in chemical reactions. But in nuclear chemistry, you have to separate the isotopes and look at what each one does individually. I just want to make sure that you know this one thing about how you write isotopes. If you have an isotope silver 108, the 108 is the same as the top number in the symbol, and the 47 is the protons. So if you take the top minus the bottom, you get the number of neutrons. I already said that there's two kinds of nuclei. There's stable ones that don't emit radiation, but the ones that do emit radiation and change the nucleus are called radioactive. The reason why nuclei are radioactive is they basically have too much energy to hold together. So if a nucleus is too energetic, it'll package up a particle and shoot it out of the nucleus, and the particle carries away extra energy. And when it does that, the nucleus becomes more stable after it. Sometimes you can shoot out one particle and the atom will become stable. Sometimes you have to shoot off a whole series of particles before it becomes stable. I want to give you an idea of what the isotopes of elements look like. Most nuclei that have been discovered or man-made are radioactive by far. All of those are trying to emit radiation so that they can become stable. Although there's only a few of the stable isotopes, they are by far the most abundant. So an element might have 2 or 3 stable isotopes, but there might be 20 known isotopes that are discovered and studied, but there's very, very small amounts of the radioactive ones. And so the stable ones are by far the most abundant. What people have found is that in stable nuclei, they have slightly more neutrons than protons in most of them. The graph I'm showing here is what's called the band of stability. If you plot the number of protons versus the number of neutrons in an isotope and put a black dot where the stable ones are, that's the band where the stable elements are. Now, the line where the protons equal neutrons is in red, so you can see that it lies a little to the left, because most of the stable nuclei have a few more neutrons than protons. The thing that will make the element radioactive is if it has, for example, too many neutrons. If it lies to the left of the band, it will do the process called beta emission in order to get stable. If it lies to the right of the band where it has too many protons, it will do either electron capture or positron emission or both. If it has too many particles, up at the top it will do what's called alpha emission, where an alpha particle is 2 neutrons and 2 protons, so the nucleus gets rid of particles and gets smaller. I'm not going to make you know what radiation process an atom would go through, but I do want you to know what the processes are, what the particles are, and how you write equations for each of the decays. I want to give you a feel for what's known about isotopes that are radioactive. First of all nuclei larger than number 83 bismuth are radioactive. It seems like above that the atom is too big to actually hold together. So any atom on the periodic table that has a number greater than 83 is radioactive. And if you look at the element polonium, number 84, the weight is in parentheses. The reason why they put it in parentheses is that that is the most stable known isotope, or the one that lasts the longest. We already said that what process an isotope will go through to become stable depends on how many protons and neutrons it has relative to stable ones. The largest isotope, or the largest element that you can find in nature, is number 92 uranium. The uranium isotopes decay so slowly that it seems like they're there forever, even though they are giving off radiation. And so actually, because they're so slow, you can use mass spectrometer to get a separation of the uranium isotopes, and you can get a number for the atomic weight. If you look at this table, the two elements, thorium number 90 and uranium number 92, both have a weight listed because there are actually enough there are enough isotopes that last long enough in nature that you could actually get a weight for these. The thing is that all the elements above number 92 have to be man-made because they're not found in nature. And we're going to talk about how you make these larger man-made elements later. The first question I want to look at is what makes a nucleus radioactive? If you take a physics class, they're going to tell you that there's three fundamental forces in physics. Fundamental forces are ones that if you put two bodies next to each other, they will either attract or repel without you doing anything. One of these is gravity, and everybody knows what that is. If big bodies are put next to each other, they'll attract each other by gravity. Electroweak forces are the ones that are responsible for electricity and magnetism. Positive attracts negative, but similar charges repel. There is a third one that's called the nuclear force, and this was discovered by Einstein through relativity by the math first, and then they verified it by experiments over and over after the math was done. The thing is that this is a force that only acts over very short distances in the nucleus, but it is much stronger than the electroweak force. See, the thing is, if you went by the electroweak force and you jammed a bunch of positive protons together in a tiny nucleus, they would want to repel each other and fly apart. The force by which they want to fly apart is sometimes called the weak nuclear force, but I believe that's just an electroweak force. The nuclear force is 30 times stronger, and it tends to hold the nucleus together so that it doesn't fly apart. The question is, how can you explain what the nuclear force is? This is one way to look at it. If a physicist tells us that if you weigh two protons and two neutrons separately from each other, the total mass is going to be 4.0331 atomic mass units. Now, if you bind those particles together in a nucleus, you would expect them to weigh the same. Why would they weigh any different? Just because they're touching. But in a nucleus, that is not the case. In a nucleus, when you put the particles together in a nucleus, they actually lose weight. I said, I wish this worked for human beings. Wouldn't it be nice if you could lose weight by just snuggling closer together? But it doesn't work. The difference in the mass is what they call a mass defect. And how do you explain why it loses weight? The answer is provided by relativity, discovered by Einstein. His famous equation, E equals mc squared, it tells you that it is possible for mass to be converted into energy. If you convert a small amount of mass, m, into energy, you have to multiply by the speed of light squared. The speed of light is a huge number and you square it. So what that means is that if you convert a very tiny amount of mass into energy, it will be a huge amount of energy. And that's the reason why the energies that come into nuclear processes are so large because mass is being converted into energy. And they call the energy that comes off binding energy because in order to break the nuclei, or in order to break the nucleus back apart, you'd have to put all that energy back in order to break it apart. So the idea is that anytime a nucleus releases E equals mc squared energy, it is actually increasing in binding energy because the nucleus is becoming more stable. The energy that comes off increases the binding energy because you would have to put it back in order to break the nucleus back apart. The energy that the nuclei give off in order to become more stable, the excess energy, is released as radiation particles. So stable nuclei don't have too much energy, but radioactive isotopes have too much, and so they have to give off radiation in order to increase their binding energy and become more stable. This is a graph that we're going to use in the next class. This is actually a graph of the number of nuclear particles, in other words, the size of the nucleus, protons plus neutrons, versus the amount of binding energy that it takes to hold them together. I don't think it surprises anybody that it doesn't take as much energy to hold together nuclei that are smaller, but as the nuclei get bigger, it takes more and more energy to bind them together. There's a most stable element on the periodic table, which I understand is iron. So the same ones that we looked at in group 3, the ones on the top row, the transition elements, are also the most stable nuclei. Doesn't have anything to do with the chemistry, but it is interesting. Now, after you get bigger than iron, though, you can see that the binding energy starts to go down slightly. What that means is the nucleus is having a harder and harder time staying together. And by the time you get to 83 bismuth, it can never stay together at all. They're all radioactive, but they do put the uranium isotope sometimes on the line that's stable. Looks stable because they decay so slowly that they're almost stable. Now the question is, where would a radioactive isotope lie on this graph? Well, it would lie below the green line because it doesn't have enough binding energy. And so it has to give off energy in order to become more stable, and that will increase the binding energy until it reaches the stable green line. And there's one isotope that has a nucleus that has a very unusual amount of stability. Helium is way above what you would expect in stability. The next element, lithium, goes way down. And this is going to be important when we talk about fusion. And it's also probably the reason, at least partly, why one of the particles that nuclei give off is alpha particles, which is a helium nucleus, because they're very stable. We're actually going to look at 5 different decay processes that atoms go through. Now, this has been discovered in the lab. If you want to ask me, why are these the particles that come off and why is this how it happens, I would say you're consulting the wrong person. You would have to consult the creator of the universe who made this system and ask him why. I have no idea. There are theories about it, but nobody is 100% sure. All I want to do is show you what particles do come off, and these are the ones that are used in medical stuff. So I'm just going to do the particles. They're written according to the Greek alphabet, some of them, and I'm doing them in alphabetical order because alpha, beta, and gamma are the first 3 letters in the Greek alphabet. So let's talk about alpha radiation first. You make an alpha, it kind of looks like a fish, a fat fish. And what an alpha particle is it is 2 protons and 2 neutrons, but because they come from the nucleus, there are no electrons on it, and this particle gets shot out of the nucleus. That's why they call an alpha particle a helium nucleus, because it's the same as helium, 2 protons and 2 neutrons, but without any electrons. Now this shows what's happening in the nucleus when an alpha particle gets shot out. It's called alpha emission or alpha decay, either one. Uranium-238 is known to do this. All that's happening in alpha emission is that a little piece of the nucleus is breaking off and getting shot out, and the little piece contains 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Now remember, you can always figure out how many neutrons there are by taking the top minus the bottom in the symbol. So uranium, to start with, has 92 protons, and it has 238 minus 92, or 46 neutrons. If the nucleus does alpha emission, you're going to end up with 2 fewer neutrons and 2 fewer protons, and an alpha particle comes off. Now remember that in nuclear notation, you have protons on the bottom and protons plus neutrons on the top. You have to know how to write each one of these particles. That's the reason why you write an alpha particle as a helium with 2 on the bottom and 4 on the top, because it's actually the same as a helium atom but without the electrons, and that's what helium has. 2 protons and 2 neutrons. And we did the same thing with the uranium that you're starting with. Uranium has 92 protons to start with, and if you take 238 minus 92, it tells you 146 neutrons. If you give off an alpha particle, you're going to end up with 2 fewer neutrons and 2 fewer protons. This is called either alpha emission or alpha decay. And the thing is, we need to find out what the new nucleus actually is. What element is it? So we have to look at the periodic table. What is element 90? You probably haven't looked at these a lot, but if you look at them, element 90 is Th, or thorium. And so that's the one you would write. And that is the appropriate symbol. So you have a complete equation at the bottom. The reason why nuclear equations are so easy to balance is that all it is just adding. The top numbers on one side have to add up to the top number on the other side, and the bottom numbers on one side have to add up to the bottom number on the other side. And you can see that that's the case here. So you don't really have to do all that diagramming of what's going on in the nucleus. You can just do it by mathematically making sure the tops and the bottoms add up. The next kind of radiation is called beta radiation. That's the second letter in the Greek alphabet. You make a beta, kind of looks like a B, but it's not too good. I always say it kind of looks like a bee that just got done smoking a reefer or something. But anyway, you write it as beta, and this particle is an electron. Now the symbol for an electron we're going to talk about, but what's the difference between a beta particle and a regular electron? Nothing. They're the same particle. Electrons in atoms are moving around the nucleus, but if they're in a beam, all of them going in one direction, or they're coming out from the center where the sample is in a sphere, that's called beta radiation, but the particle is the same. One of the ones that gives off beta radiation is phosphorus-32, which is what you use to label the backbone of DNA radioactively. I spent 2 years at Argonne doing a project where I was labeling the backbone of DNA with phosphorus-32 over and over again in order to do experiments with it. The thing is, if you look at the symbol for phosphorus 32, the number on the bottom, 15, is the number of protons. But if you look at that, you could also think of it as the nucleus having a plus 15 charge. So the number on the bottom can be looked at either as protons or as the charge. In writing the symbol for an electron or a beta particle, you put a -1 on the bottom because the charge of an electron is -1, and that's what you need to do to balance nuclear equations. The 0 on the top does not mean that electrons have no mass, but they have such little bit of mass that it's negligible compared to a proton or neutron. So when you balance, it's as if the electron has a 0 mass. So that's why you write the beta particle like that. Now first I want to look at what happens if the nucleus gives off a beta particle. Now just think about that a minute though. Am I trying to tell you that all of a sudden, after your whole semester of 131, now in 132 I'm telling you there's an electron in the nucleus? Your 131 teacher would shoot you if you tried to tell her that. But the point is, in nuclear chem, it happens. I'm going to show you how it happens, but the thing is, I just want you to know that if an electron did form in the nucleus, it would immediately get shot out. Even though it's attracted to the protons by electroweak force, the nuclear force would shoot it out of the nucleus. An electron is a very big particle compared to protons and neutrons, but it's also very light. It's like a big bleb forms in the middle of the nucleus, and it just doesn't belong there. And so the protons and neutrons that are left kind of cram closer together, and they just shoot the electron out just like a watermelon seed. And that's why they expel it. Now what I want to do first is how would you balance this equation? You have to have the tops and the bottoms add up. So what number would you need on the bottom? Not 14. It's 16. 16 minus 1 is 15, and you're going to have 32 on the top. So that's what would be left. And I want to look at what element that would be. So if you look at the periodic table, what is element 16? Element 16 is S, or sulfur. So that's what you would write. Now I want to ask, what does a sulfur nucleus look like? And I draw it in the next slide. The sulfur has 16 protons and 32 minus 16, or 16 neutrons. So the question is, what actually happened to the nucleus when the beta came off? Well, you started with 17 neutrons, and now you have 16. So you lost 1 neutron. And you started with 15 protons, and now you have 16, so you gained a proton. My question is, would it work if, in the process of giving off the beta, you actually converted a neutron in the nucleus into a proton? Then you would have 1 less neutron and 1 more proton. And that's what scientists believe actually happens in beta emission. A neutron in the nucleus changes into a proton and an electron, and the electron gets shot out of the nucleus, but the proton stays behind. Now this is not actually the way it happens, but I wanted to draw a cartoon of it. You could think of a neutron, because it's neutral, as having a plus side and a negative side, and it's possible that it could split in half. If the neutron split in half, it's possible that the positive side, the plus 1, could be a proton that stays behind in the nucleus, and the negative side could be an electron that gets shot out. Now that doesn't prove anything, but it shows why it's reasonable. The truth of it is, though, this is not actually what's happening. People have shown through the high energy nuclear collider reactions that neutrons and protons are actually made of three smaller particles. And those particles are called quarks. I call it the duck particle. I say quark, quark, quark. So protons and neutrons have quarks which have a spin, just like an electron. Each quark is spinning and it has a north pole and a south pole. And I want to show you what protons and neutrons look like diagrammatically. Believe it or not, a proton is actually two up quarks and a down quark. The only difference between a proton and a neutron is that that red quark in the upper right hand flips down. And that turns it into a neutron. It's kind of hard to believe, but this is what nuclear physicists say is the difference. What they say is actually happening in the nucleus when a beta comes off is that the neutron, which has a down quark in the upper right, that quark actually flips up. And in the process of doing that, the particle becomes a proton, and what gets shot out is an electron. So you lose hardly any mass, but you lose a complete -1 charge. Now, if I was going to ask you a question about this, I might ask you something like, radon-222 is an alpha emitter. You don't have to know what particles come off. I will tell you, or else you can figure it out. But if I do tell you, I want you to write a balanced equation. So first of all, you have to know how to write radon-222. You can see from the periodic table that radon is actually element 86. And now you have to know how to write an alpha particle, which is a helium with a 2,4. What you need to get the new nucleus now is to make the tops and the bottoms add up. So you can see that on the top of the new particle, you would need a 218, and on the bottom, you would need a 84. So once you decide that, you have to look in the periodic table and say, what element is 84? And if you look closely, you can see that that element is polonium, PO. One reason I like this equation is because polonium is a very famous isotope because it was the very first radioactive isotope ever discovered. Madame Curie and her husband Pierre are usually given credit for discovering radium, which is the famous one, but the one that they actually discovered first was polonium. And because of the fact that Madame Curie was Polish, she came from Poland, that element is named after the country of Poland, polonium. Now at the beginning of this class, I showed you that carbon-14 is a beta emitter. We can now write the equation for that. So the first thing you have to do is know how to write a beta particle. And once you write the beta particle, you now have to get the numbers for the top and the bottom. So you're going to need a 7 on the bottom and a 14 on the top. And then the question is, what is element 7? Probably already know this, but element 7 is nitrogen. In the first slide I showed you concerning nuclear chemistry, I said that carbon-14 decays to nitrogen and gives off radiation. Now you know what the radiation is. It's actually beta. The thing is now, in the next class, I want to stop here and we're going to continue with looking at the other 3 radiation processes that nuclei give off. And we're also going to look at the other 3 nuclear reactions because they're very important in the world in general. And so this is where we'll pick up next time. Now, gamma radiation is the next one I want to talk about. It's the 3rd letter in the Greek alphabet. It kind of looks like a fish, except the fish is standing on his nose. Anyway, gamma radiation does not have any mass. This is one of the particles without mass. The The particles are photons, which are packages of energy, but they have no mass and no charge. As I showed you before, these are the most energetic form of electromagnetic radiation, and this is what comes off of some nuclei. Now, because it doesn't have any charge or mass, I want to look at what happens to the nucleus. This technetium is what I told you can inject into heart patients and watch the heart beating on a fluoroscope. It's a gamma emitter, which a lot of elements are. And so what would happen to the nucleus if this gave off a gamma particle? So since the gamma particle does not have any mass or any charge, actually, after it comes off, the nucleus doesn't change. This is the only process where you get the same nucleus after as you did before. The thing about it is, though, you still give off energy because the nucleus to start with is in an excited state. They'll show that usually by putting a star or a plus or something by it. And afterwards, they'll take the star off to show that it's now more stable. The thing about it is, they say that protons and neutrons are in energy levels just like electrons, but in the nucleus, it's way more energetic. So if a particle falls to a lower energy level, it gives off gamma. If an electron falls to a lower energy level in the outside of an atom, it only gives off energy enough to make, for example, maybe ultraviolet or visible light. So in the nucleus, the energies are higher. But if the nucleus doesn't change, why does it even do this? Well, it does it for the same reason as what would happen to you if you were on an empty stomach and you chugged a 2-liter Pepsi. You would be in an excited state. The way you would get rid of the excitement is to burp. So I call gamma a nucleus burping. If you want to get cruder, you can call it a nucleus doing something else, but I would prefer to stick with burping. The next kind of radiation we're going to talk about is positron emission. Now, if you look at the definition of this, you will think I lost my mind. I'm telling you that positrons emission consists of particles that are positively charged electrons. So first, I told you there's electrons in the nucleus. Now I'm telling you there's positively charged electrons. I want to show you that this really is true. And how would you write a particle like this? Well, since it's an electron, you're still going to write an E, but the charge is +1. And it has no particular mass relative to protons and neutrons. And they write beta plus to distinguish it from a negative beta particle. So this is the symbol. And this is actually one of the particles of a whole new type of matter. And this matter, though, has been around for a long time. I think it may have been around even when I was little. This is what's called antimatter. People have discovered particles that are positrons, positive electrons. Antiprotons are negative protons, and antineutrons are a different particle from neutrons, but they still have no charge. What they say is that the antimatter particles are actually the mirror image of the matter particles. And for some reason, when you take the mirror image, you change the charge. Nobody really understands this stuff completely, but this is what physics has found out. Now, the thing about antimatter is you can only study it one particle at a time, because whenever an antimatter particle runs into an ordinary matter particle, they completely disintegrate and they convert each other into energy according to E equals mc squared. You could say they annihilate each other. That's a great word. This is the most energetic process that people are aware of at present. When we look at like fission and fusion, you convert some of the mass to energy, but not all of it. In this one, you convert all the mass to energy. So that means if you give off a positron, it is going to run into an electron immediately in the same atom. It's not even going to get out of the atom. And they convert each other completely into energy. Physicists have found that this energy has a specific wavelength or energy. Usually gamma rays are in a spectrum, but in a positron-electron collision, the gamma rays are produced. That's what the energy is in the form of, and they are exactly 0.511 mega electron volt gamma rays. You don't have to know that number, but the thing is, if you see this specific wavelength of gamma coming out of a nuclear decay, you know that you've had a positron emission. Now, because of the fact that antimatter destroys matter, you're not going to find a bottle of antimatter sitting anywhere in the lab. You theoretically could make it because you could use these particles to make the same kind of atoms as regular matter, but if you had a bottle of antimatter, it would be in the process of destroying all the matter on Earth. So you're never going to do that. You can only study this one particle at a time. The nucleus I want to show that does positron emission is fluorine-18, because this is also the isotope that they use in medicine in what are called PET scans, positron emission, PE. And if you look at what a fluorine-18 is, it has 9 neutrons and 9 protons. If it gives off a positron, what's actually happening in the nucleus? Well, let's do the same thing we did with beta. Let's complete the reaction. In order to make the bottoms add up, you would need an 8. In order to make the top add up, you need 18. And element 18 is oxygen. And this is one of the stable isotopes of oxygen, 18. Now, what's in the nucleus in an oxygen 18? Well, you can see that there would be 8 protons and 10 neutrons. So what happens in a beta emission, in a positron emission, is that you get an extra neutron, but you lose a proton. And so what people are convinced happens in this reaction is that you actually convert a proton into a neutron this time. And of course, this has to do with quarks flipping. And so the result, though, this time is that a proton changes into a neutron, and it's a positron that gets shot out. I drew this here that a proton could be considered to have a 0 side and a +1 side, and if it's split in 2, you could actually get the neutron, which is the 0 side, stays in the nucleus, and the positron gets emitted as a +1 particle. And the truth is that they say that in this process, instead of getting a beta like you do when you convert a neutron into a proton, you actually get the mirror image of an electron comes off, and that's a positron. If you look at it relative to the quarks, the same quark that is in the upper right-hand corner, in a proton it spins up, so in order to go to a neutron, it flips down. This is the exact opposite of what happens in beta, and you get the particle that's the mirror image of an electron, so it has a +1 charge instead of -1. And as we said previously, when the positron comes out of the nucleus, it's going to destroy an electron, and what you're actually going to see coming out as radiation is those 0.511 mega electron volt gamma rays. Positron emission is the basis of probably the most sensitive cancer detection technique that exists today. This kind of a scan is very expensive, so they only do it if they have to, but it is a very sensitive one. The way you do a PET scan, and it's positron emission tomography. Tomography is a software program that takes the data from a machine and converts it into a picture of the human body that human beings can actually understand. And the way they do these tests is they label one molecule of glucose with a radioactive fluorine-18 atom, and they inject it into a patient. Now, the thing about glucose is the labeled glucose goes the same place as regular glucose goes. And the thing is, where is that? Well, the reason you have blood sugar or glucose is for energy. That's your big energy source. And so the glucose goes wherever you're using the most energy. And if you're at rest, that would be in your brain and your heart. And you know that cancer cells are dividing faster than anything, so they accumulate more of the glucose than any other tissue. So you can detect cancer very well. And the differences between normal and abnormal tissue then are very clear. The thing is, you can even do brain scanning with PET scan to show the difference between different brain states, and I'm going to show that also. The way they label the glucose is that they put a fluorine-18 at what's called carbon-2. Now, this is the kind of a picture you're going to be seeing in organic all the time. Each one of the intersection points between two lines in the glucose is a carbon atom, so they don't show them all. And the carbon atoms in glucose have OH groups attached to them, and this is an alcohol group. Now, the thing is, the glucose exists as a six-membered ring, and oxygen is one of the atoms. If you take the carbon, which is labeled carbon-2, you can, by organic synthesis techniques, remove the OH and put on a radioactive fluorine. The thing about that is fluorine and OH have about the same diameter, so it doesn't really change the molecule that much. But when the labeled glucose gets into a cell, there's one step in glycolysis that gets blocked. So the labeled glucose tends to remain glucose in the cell longer than regular glucose, and you can see very clearly where it is. This is an actual PET scan of a patient from the hospital. So they injected this person with radio-labeled glucose and took a scan. In the top bunch of pictures, that's a normal. So when, I don't know why they cut the guy's head off, but anyway, they cut off his head. So without your head, the two places that that you see the glucose in are your heart, which is beating all the time, and the bladder, which is the tracer being excreted. So this is what a normal person looks like. The classic experiment for PET scanning is if you take an X-ray of your lungs, you can't tell whether a spot you see on the lung is cancer or not. But if you do a PET scan, you can do that without having to biopsy anything. So the bottom pictures are someone with lung cancer. And if you look at that, the lung cancer accumulates more label than anything. And so the spot on the lung accumulates so much radiation that you don't even have to leave the machine on anywhere near as long, and so it overwhelms any of the other places and the cancer lights up. So you can tell from this where the cancer is and that it is cancer. The other thing they do with PET scanning is to map brain metabolism. Your brain can take up the label as you're normally thinking, and the tomography converts it into a picture that the most metabolizing areas are red, and then the next ones are yellow, etc. Green is next, and then blue is no metabolism. So what they're doing in this picture is they're trying to be able to detect Alzheimer's before someone dies. The only way to detect Alzheimer's now is to take a brain biopsy at death. If you take a brain biopsy, Alzheimer's patients have these plaques in the brain that contain aluminum ions. That's characteristic of Alzheimer's. They want to be able to diagnose different dementias before a person dies, because some of the dementias are actually treatable. So if you know that it's not Alzheimer's, it might be a treatable one and you might be able to do something about it. You can see in this picture how much the metabolism decreases as Alzheimer's gets worse. And that's the reason why people can't remember anything and don't recognize people, because the brain is slowly being destroyed and it just doesn't metabolize as well. They've also used PET scanning to show the difference between different psychological states. If you look at the brain on the left, that's what a normal metabolic pattern looks like. The thing is, the picture on the right is a schizophrenic. And if you look at the little notch at the bottom of the skull picture, that's the backbone. So that area that's lighting up red is actually the optic center in the brain. It processes sight. And so you can see that this person is probably having hallucinations during the test. It's kind of unbelievable, but what they've done by doing scans like this is they have shown that some of the major psychoses like schizophrenia and bipolar are actually brain metabolism diseases, and the truth of it is both of those are highly genetic. You can actually trace schizophrenia through family lines. They used to be able to do it with royal families, but now they can do it with a lot of families because they have these DNA analysis techniques for genealogies now, and they have shown that both schizophrenia and bipolar are pretty much genetic. I've read things that if you get the genes for bipolar, there's only about a 2% chance that you're not going to have the disease. And so in those very serious conditions, psychology has had to pretty much abandon the idea that things like bipolar and schizophrenia come from how your mother potty trained you. They are biochemical diseases of the brain. They just don't always know the origin of them. The other thing is that a neurotic disease like chronic depression or something, which is what I have, that does not show a real distinct difference in the brain metabolism patterns, so it's hard to distinguish between the two, and neurotic depression probably has components of both environmental and genetic components, but they're not really clear on what those are. The other kind of a experiment that they've done with this is to detect different kinds of epilepsy. If you can get a person to have an epileptic seizure during a PET scan, you can actually see what areas of the brain are involved in the epilepsy because they light up. Sometimes you can find one focal point, and if they remove that through brain surgery, sometimes they can significantly reduce the epilepsy. If the epilepsy goes across the whole brain, they can sometimes do a surgery where they cut the corpus callosum, which is the connection between the right and the left halves of the brain, and that seems to decrease the globalized epilepsy a lot, and that's where you get those left and right brain experiments. You can't tell without the cut in the corpus callosum because the halves of the brain can communicate with each other through it, but if you cut it, the only way the brain can communicate one side to the other is with senses like sight and speech and things like that. So that's where you get those right and left brain experiments where you stop the things from the left side and you find out what the right brain does and vice versa. So those are usually epilepsy patients that have had the connection severed. You don't have to even have a disease for PET scanning to be interesting. You can do brain mapping. If you give a volunteer radioactive glucose and then put them in a dark room and have them do different activities, whatever area of the brain is used in that activity lights up. So as you can see, when they show a picture to somebody, the optic center lights up at the back of the cortex. If you're listening to Mozart or something, there's a large component of both left and right brain audio center, but also vision and also thinking in the front. So it's really, music is a pretty general stimulus. What they call thinking is, like you give them a math problem to do, the front of the brain is the cerebrum is the executive center that's responsible for thinking, and so that lights up. They show memory in the picture and motor activity working. So it's really interesting because you can see what areas of the brain are involved in different activities without having to use any kind of surgery or electrodes or anything like that. The last kind of radiation process I want to talk about is called electron capture, which the Handbook of Chemistry and Physics abbreviates EC. The way this works is that you know that the electrons in the 1s orbital, the first shell, are very close to the nucleus. If the nucleus can do this, to become stable, it just reaches out and pulls an electron into the nucleus and absorbs it from the 1s orbital. That's why it's also called K capture, because in the Bohr model, the first shell is called the K shell. When this happens, you write the electron being added to the nucleus, so you write it on the left instead of on the right like you do in beta. And argon-37 is one of the nuclei that does this almost exclusively electron capture. So I want to see what happens in the nucleus in this case. In order to make the bottoms add up, you would write a 17 and the top's 37. Chlorine-37 is one of the two stable isotopes of chlorine. That isotope would have 20 neutrons and 17 protons, which means this time you're increasing by 1 neutron and you're decreasing by 1 proton. And so a proton in the nucleus changes into a neutron. I showed this graphically by saying that a proton, the black one, combines with the incoming electron, and if you add the tops and the bottoms, that would form a neutron. But you know that what's actually happening has to do with the quarks flipping, so let's look at that. In this case, when the electron combines, it actually causes the up quark in the proton on the upper right to flip down again, which turns the thing back into a neutron. Now you have to realize this is all happening right next to the nucleus. So how in the world do you even know it's happening? The idea is that if you take an electron out of the first level, that is not a happy situation. You know that electrons have to be paired. And so when you have that unpaired electron, it's not going to stay that way. What happens is electrons from up in higher levels fall into the hole that was created, and energies related to the fall of the electron are in the energy range of X-rays this time. If you can get an isotope of an element that is a electron capture atom, it really is helpful to scientists because you can get a spectrum where you can measure all the energy levels in the atom by measuring the different energies of the electron falls that occur. So it's X-rays that are coming out that you actually see. The energy in the electron shell is not as high as it is in the nucleus, but it's still very high. And so X-rays that come off are not as energetic as the gamma rays, but they're still ionizing radiation and they're very energetic. I want to show you one thing about the last two processes we discussed. If you take the two atoms I showed here, antimony 114 decays to tin 114. There's nothing special about those atoms. I just want to use it to make a point. What are two decay processes that could account for this change? Well, since you know what the particles are, you just try them. Obviously, if you put an alpha particle in there, that's not going to work because the tops and bottoms don't add up. Beta radiation won't work because 50 minus 1 is not 51. But if you put a positron on the right instead, that does work. And so one of the things that happens in this decay is positron emission. But if you do electron capture, where you put an electron on the left, that will also produce tin 114, and so electron capture also works. Both of those processes produce what they call the same daughter nucleus, and most atoms or isotopes that do one of those processes also do the other one. So I'm guessing that if you measure the positron, or I'm sorry, the gamma to X-ray ratio, you can get the ratio of how much positron emission is and how much electron capture it is. The Handbook of Chemistry and Physics reports what percentage of each of these radiations is given off by isotopes that emit both, and usually they do emit both. If they do one, they do the other also. The next very important topic to do in kinetics is the kinetics of radioactive isotopes, because if you're going to give patients radiation, you have to make sure you give them the exactly correct dose. If you give them 10 times too much, they might die. If you don't give them enough, you won't see anything. So how do you measure radiation? The truth of it is you can measure radioactivity as grams, moles, or atoms, just like we have in the past in the 131 and 132, but the truth is usually you don't, because radioactivity is usually not pure. It's in a compound, and it's also mixed with usually stable isotopes, and so they use a different unit. The unit they use is called activity. It's the number of decays a sample gives off per time. If you have a sample of a radioactive element sitting on the table and you measure how many particles come off of it per second, obviously, if you double the size of the sample, you're going to double the number of particles that come off. So the number of decays or particles that come off is a measure of how much is there. The Curie is named after Madame Curie, is the basic unit, and it's 10 to sometimes 10 to the 10th decays per second. The only place you're going to see that much radiation is in maybe a nuclear power plant or a nuclear bomb. In labs, they usually use like millicuries, which is 1,000th of a curie, a microcurie even. I've seen it go all the way down to nanocuries. You don't have to do conversions between these. All I want you to know is that if I give you millicuries, for example, it means that it's an amount of radioactivity, so I'm going to ask you for the answer in the same unit. We're going to do kinetic equations on radioactivity because what is done in the equations is that the amount of radioactivity is just usually written as a capital X. It's not molarity or grams or anything, but sometimes it is, but rarely. It's usually X. All 5 of the decay processes that we talked about are actually first order. And so we're going to use the same first order equation, ln of x0 over xt equals kt, that we used for first order kinetics. And the half-life formula is the same. If you know the k, you can get the half-life. And if you know the half-life, you can get the k. Usually what they give you in radioactivity is the half-life. And so what you have to do first is convert the half-life to k in order to plug it into the equation. And I want to show you a couple of problems. Cobalt-60 is a beta emitter, and it was actually the first isotope that was used in radiation treatment. Sometimes they would just lay the cobalt-60 right on the patient. Obviously, that's no good because the whole patient gets irradiated. And nowadays, these isotopes are all in machines. You have to get a bachelor's degree in radiation therapy in order to even do radiation therapy in the hospital, and you have to get official certifications. It's a very difficult technique. You have to know the physics to be able to measure the radioactivity dose coming out. You have to be able to manipulate the machine so that it is directed at exactly the right part of the patient. And it's also usually a pretty depressing field because you have to get patients into the correct position, and you're talking about cancer patients, most of the time, who are in pain. They're screaming as you put them on the table, trying to get them in the right position. It is not a fun activity, but is very necessary in medicine. Cobalt-60 has a half-life of 5.26 years. Now, you can find any half-lives as far as radioactive isotopes all the way from milliseconds all the way up to 1 billion years. It's a property of the isotope. The half-life is how long it takes for the sample to lose half the radioactivity, and it's first order. So if you had a sample of cobalt-60 that was new, after 2 years or something, you would have to correct for the dose because you're going to have lost a lot of it. The machines do that automatically, but you still have to know how to calculate it. So I want to do some problems with this. I want to first of all calculate the rate constant because that's what you usually have to do first. Then I'm going to ask those kind of questions we did in kinetics. If you start with a certain amount, how much is left, or how long will it take to reach a certain amount? I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on this because we already did these problems in kinetics, but I want to show them to you related to radioactivity. If you want to get the K value that you can plug into the first order equation, you just take 0.693 divided by the half-life gives you the K value. Part B of the problem says we're going to start with 200 and let it go for 14.2 years. How much is left? That's the bottom of the fraction, and the K value we plugged in also. And so we want to solve that equation for x sub t. You take the inverse log of both sides because inverse log gets rid of the log. and then you have to solve the fractional equation that's left. So however you do that, we've done it several times now, you have to get 200 divided by 6.49, and that is 30.8. For part B, problem says if you start with 200, how long does it take to get to 3.4? So you're going to leave t as the variable this time. You can calculate the ln on your calculator and then divide by what's next to the t, and it shows that it takes 30.9 years. Now this is a question that is showing how can you get the K value for an isotope. If you remember, when we had first order, you used to take the ln and make a third column of the concentrations that were left at different times and then get the slope. That's not usually what they do with radioactivity because it's harder to make the measurement. What they'll usually do is start with a certain amount, figure out how much is left at a certain time, and plug in the equation. So I'm going to say we're starting with 3.42 milligrams that decays to 1.79 in only 10.3 seconds. So I want to calculate K and the half-life. The thing is, this is a very fast isotope, so you would probably have to use something like an oscilloscope to even measure this. So what I did this time was plug in the numbers and leave K as the variable. When you solve for K, it gives you the value in seconds to the -1, which is the right units. And then you can get the half-life by taking 0.693 divided by K. So it only takes 11 seconds to go to half. That's a very fast time. I also want to do problems that involve percents when it comes to isotopes because this is a very important question that people ask. Let's say that you start with a certain amount of a radioactive isotope, but it's a waste product. You have to dispose of it somehow. And so there's nothing you can do with it. You just have to leave it sit. So people want to know how long will it take for that radioactivity to decay to like 1% or 0.1% till it's almost gone, in other words. And so percentage is a big thing in radioactive isotopes. So I want to ask the question, what percent of the isotope we just did is left after 30 seconds? Now there are certainly more than one way to do a percent problem, but this seems like the easiest to me. Since I didn't tell you how much you have to start with 100, because percent is parts out of 100. So if you start with 100, whatever you're left with is the percentage. You don't have to do anything with it. So I plugged in 100 for the starting amount and also the K and the T. The slide shows the math that you would use to get X sub T, and you don't have to do anything with it if you start with 100 because 15.2 is the answer, and that's parts out of 100 or percent. This question asks, how long will it take for an isotope to decay to a certain percent? The half-life of this one is 123 years, and this is actually the isotope iodine-123, which is used in hospitals a lot, and so it has a very long half-life. People want to know how long will it take for it to get down to a reasonable amount, and so you can do that by calculating percentage. So first you got to calculate the K value, so you take 0.693 divided by the half-life. In order to get the percentage, the best way I think to do it is to start with 100 and go down to 2.2 because 2.2 is the parts out of 100. So I plugged in the 100, the 2.2, and the value of K. So after you take the ln and divide by what's next to the T, you can get 679 years. Now, that waste then would have to be disposed of by the hospital. That is a big problem because how long is 679 years compared to a human lifetime? it is basically forever. And so as long as you generate this waste, it's going to be around basically forever. You have to somehow just sequester it from the human population so that there's not going to be exposure to people of the radioactive waste. And hospitals have to have a sophisticated ways of, according to the law, disposing of radioactive waste so that they can keep it away from the population as much as possible. But it is a very complicated waste disposal system that has to be run by experts in the field. I next want to talk about the reaction called nuclear fission, which is not that important medically, but it is important for a lot of things in the world, so I want to discuss it. This is the energy source for nuclear power plants that make electricity, and there's lots of them all over the world. And it's also the energy source that they used in the atomic bombs that they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. There's only 3 isotopes known that can actually do this reaction: uranium-233, 235, and plutonium-239. The one they use in the power plants is uranium-235. The way you have to do this is to mine uranium. The thing is, uranium is mostly uranium-238. And so you have to go through a very long, expensive, dangerous purification process to get the uranium-235 enriched. And a lot of small countries that want to build an atomic bomb, anybody can make the casing for an atomic bomb. It's a very simple process, but they can't get the fuel. It's very hard to purify it, and so it requires a lot of money. But in nuclear power plants, this is the isotope that's used. The way the reaction works is that any sample of uranium-235 already has neutrons being produced. It's neutron radiation, and if a neutron runs into a fissionable nucleus, it splits the nucleus into smaller nuclei, just like shooting something with a bullet. It shatters it. And when you produce these smaller nuclei, you give off a huge amount of energy because you are converting some of the mass to energy according to E equals mc squared. If you look at this binding energy graph that I showed you last class, you start with U-235. If you convert it into smaller nuclei, the binding energy increases. It goes up the slope. And the thing is, that means in order to increase the binding energy, the nuclei are giving off E equals mc squared energy. They basically just cram closer together and give off some of the energy. The other thing about a fission reaction is people have studied uranium-235, and what continues the reaction is the fact that for each uranium-235 that's split, it takes 1 neutron to split it, but it produces, on average, 3 neutrons. The nuclei that are produced here are random in size. They're like just shattered products. But these are the nuclei that have those very long half-lives. And that is a problem. But when the 3 neutrons come off, the reaction is continued by what's called a chain reaction, because those 3 neutrons can hit 3 nuclei, and then after that you have 9 neutrons. Then you hit it again, you have 27. If you do that, you're going up by 3 to the n power, and it doesn't take very long to get that chain to explode the whole sample. I drew a diagram of a chain reaction here. You see the neutron hitting uranium-235, splitting it and giving 3 neutrons out. And then each of those hit 3 nuclei, and you get an average of 3 out, and it sure isn't going to take very long until you get a huge number of neutrons and it explodes the entire sample. The thing is that what they discovered is that the reaction will not start until you have enough of the sample in one place. It's called a critical mass. If you don't have enough critical mass, then there's still a fission reaction, but the neutrons kind of squirt out the edges and the reaction goes on, but it doesn't explode. What they did to make the nuclear bombs was they took 2 subcritical masses, and when they dropped the bomb, they forced them together inside the bomb, and that produced a critical mass, and immediately it exploded. So it's not hard to keep it from exploding as long as you keep the critical masses separate from each other, and then you slam them together when you want the bomb to blow up. Now, obviously, in a power plant, they don't want it to blow up like a bomb, and so they control this in 2 different ways. One way is that when the uranium is used for power plants, it's only enriched in uranium-235 about 3 to 5%. In order to get bomb quality material, you have to have about 95% uranium-235. So what they do is they only enrich the uranium-235 a small amount, so that even if you threw all of the fuel rods from a Commonwealth Edison plant into one place, they would not blow up like a bomb because they're not pure enough. They also use control rods or a control net that's made of carbon and boron and sometimes other elements to soak up neutrons. When you put the control rods farther into the reactor core, they soak up neutrons, which are continuing the chain reaction, and so the reaction slows down. If you pull the control rods up out of the chamber, then it speeds the reaction up. The first controlled fusion reaction in the world was run during a project called the Manhattan Project, which was done in 1942, and it is in a very famous location because it was done under one of the athletic fields near Soldier Field at the University of Chicago. As we said, the products that come from nuclear power plants when they use fission have very long half-lives. The waste atoms do. And when the fuel rod is spent so that it isn't hot enough to make any kind of boiling water again, it has to be taken out of the reactor core and stored somehow because the radiation never goes away. These have half-lives around 10,000 to 100,000 years average. What they do is they first have to put the rods into a cooling bath in order to cool them down enough to be stored. And those are vulnerable to attack from anything, terrorists or military or anything else. So they worry about that. But once they're cool enough, they put them in casks that are dry, and they are made of cement and steel, and they put these in them so that if an attack came, they'd have to release a lot more of the spent ones or the dry ones in order to release a significant amount of radiation. The thing about this is people say, well, why don't we drive the waste to a dump somewhere? Well, they're afraid the truck will break down on the way, and then all that radioactivity would leak out. Or why don't we rocket it off into outer space? Well, that's not wise either, because what if you put it on a space shuttle and the space shuttle explodes like the Challenger did? Now it's all over the Earth instead of in the rods. So what they're doing at Commonwealth Edison is they're actually keeping the spent fuel on site. And they have these cooling baths and these dry containers that store the fuel rods. And that's what the solution has been up till now. But of course, as they run out of space and things, they're probably going to have to come up with some other method. But that's the present method, is to just keep them stored on site. This is a picture of what a nuclear reactor looks like, and I think everybody should have seen this sometime in their lifetime. There are two of these that are pretty close to us that produce a lot of our electricity. One of them is south of here in the town of Braidwood, the Braidwood Nuclear Power Station. The other one is down Route 80 at a place called Dresden Locks. It's called the Dresden Power Plant. And these are nuclear reactors that are very highly controlled. But this is how a nuclear reactor actually works. Any kind of electric production plant boils water. That's by far the most common, except in hydroelectric plants. In order to boil water, if it's a coal burning plant, they burn coal to boil the water. If it's oil burning, they burn oil. I don't know, I guess they can use natural gas. The thing is that in a nuclear reactor, it's the heat from the reactor core that boils the water. What happens is the steam from the boiling water turns a turbine through a magnetic field. And in physics, you learn that if you do that, it causes the electrons to squirt out the end of the wire. And that's electricity. When the turbine goes past the north pole of the magnet, the electrons go one way. When it goes past the south pole, they go the other way. That's the reason why it's called alternating current. The electrons are actually moving back and forth in the wire, as opposed to our electrochemical cells, which are direct current, where the electrons always go in the same direction. Then they have to condense the steam and recycle it, and it's usually near some kind of a river or a pond, because they use that water to help condense the steam. In the reactor core, the heat can be transferred to the boiling water chamber either by using a liquid to transfer the heat into the steam chamber, or the reactor core can be directly in the water. And I don't remember which is which, but the Braidwood plant is one of those types, and the Dresden plant is the other type. So they boil water is the point. And you can see in this picture that those black rods that are inserted into the reactor core are made of carbon, which soaks up neutrons so they can control the rate of the fission. In a couple of the nuclear disasters, you can explain them based on this kind of a scheme. One of them was Chernobyl, and most people are familiar with that, where in the Ukraine, one of the nuclear power plants actually exploded. What happened was the controls did not work effectively. The steam chamber got too hot and the steam chamber exploded. And so it released a lot of the radioactivity from the core into the air, and it traveled in a cloud across kind of northern Europe and upwards towards Scandinavia and Iceland. There's places that still can't be farmed because of the fallout from that, because it's too radioactive, and people got cancer for years from the fallout they received from that disaster. And I believe they're still getting cancer from it. It was in the 1980s. Recently, we had the disaster in Japan, Fukushima, that uh, the reactor core of one of the plants just cracked and released stuff due to environmental things like it had an earthquake and a tsunami, and it just didn't stand the strain. So it released a bunch of radioactivity into the Pacific Ocean, and it's still there. Where it's going to go, you can't recover it from the ocean. So there are dangers in using these kind of plants, but they're very common, and they produce a lot of electricity in many different places. The reaction that's used in the latest kind of nuclear bombs, which are called hydrogen bombs, is the reaction fusion, and this is also the reaction that stars use to produce their heat. The only atom that will actually do this are isotopes of hydrogen, and they're very small, so they're not being fissioned. What happens is that when you're at a very high temperature, you can have two hydrogen isotopes actually combine or fuse into an atom of helium. And the amount of E equals mc squared energy that's produced from this process is even greater than in fission. The reason why the universe is almost all mass is either hydrogen or helium. There's only a tiny bit of mass that are other elements, and that's because this is what's going on in stars, and stars make up the vast majority of the mass in the universe. You can see why fusion gives off so much more energy than fission by looking at this binding energy graph. If you fission uranium-235 and it goes to smaller atoms, they are going up a pretty shallow slope as you go up in binding energy. But if you look at where hydrogen is down at the bottom of the graph, when you go from hydrogen up to helium, which is particularly stable, the increase is almost vertical. And so you get a greater increase in binding energy, which means you released more E equals mc squared energy. A fusion reaction does not continue by a chain reaction as fission did. Fusion actually continues because of heat. You have to maintain a certain temperature. I got this from a pretty reliable source, a textbook, that you have to have a temperature of about 100 million degrees Celsius before you can even get a fusion reaction started. At those kind of temperatures, you get a new state of matter that's called plasma. There's a phase transition from gas to plasma. The plasma is so hot that even electrons cannot stay on the atoms. Plasma is basically a mixture of ions and electrons in a cloud. There's a type of a physicist called a plasma physicist that studies these kinds of high temperature gases. The thing about this is that's the reason why hydrogen bombs create so much more energy and they vaporize such larger areas. If you explode a hydrogen bomb at ground zero, the temperature goes up to just about as hot as this is in order to get the reaction started. And they say that it vaporizes everything, which means it turns everything under it into ions and electrons. That's vaporized. There's no structures left at all after a hydrogen bomb is dropped. Now, stars are already hot enough to continue the reaction, but if human beings want to start the reaction, they have to get to a high enough temperature, and there's actually two ways to do that. One way that I believe most of the hydrogen bombs that we have that were built in the 1980s, and they're in silos all over the United States and also the old Soviet Union. In order to start a hydrogen bomb, you have to put the hydrogen fuel around the outside, and they explode a fission bomb inside, which all the fission bomb does is get the temperature hot enough to get the real bomb started, which is the hydrogen bomb. So the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs are just like a fuse compared to a hydrogen bomb. One of the predictions is that if there ever was a nuclear war that involved hydrogen bombs, the hydrogen bombs would destroy a lot of area initially, and people would get radiation effects. But there's a prediction from computer modeling that there would also be what's called a nuclear winter. The hydrogen bombs would stir up so much dust that the sun would be covered so that the temperature on Earth might fall as low as just above freezing for a period of as much as 10 years. And the effects would last for years after that. So it seems highly unlikely that anybody could actually survive a nuclear war, because of the fact that how are you going to get food production if the temperature is just above freezing? So there's different models, different speculations, but a lot of people believe that the nuclear winter might just basically destroy life on Earth, at least human life. And so that is what people predicted would be the result of a nuclear war where a lot of hydrogen bombs were exploded. People have tried to make power plants based on fusion, but it doesn't look like it's going to be very successful. For many years, what they do is they focus laser beams at a particular point, and you can get a temperature hot enough to start the reaction. But up until just a few years ago, the amount of energy that you had to put in to keep the reaction going was more than the energy that they got out. I guess it's been reported in Germany that they have reached the break-even point with some fusion reactors, but there's a lot of practical problems. The temperature's so hot, you have to keep the particles in a magnetic field instead of a container because they would melt anything else. And the amount of energy that comes out is not that much more than what you put in at the present moment. The United States doesn't do fusion research anymore. I think they decided that this is probably not going to be a very productive energy source in the future. You never know, because nobody can predict the future. It may end up being one, but at the present time, it doesn't look like it. People are going to have to come up with some other kind of an energy source rather than fossil fuel when the coal and oil run out. The last reaction I want to talk about is nuclear bombardment. This is how people make the large man-made elements that are the biggest ones on the periodic table. I showed a reaction here where you can make a small one by bombarding an element with an isotope of hydrogen. The thing is that to make the bigger ones, they do it in a device called a cyclotron, or a particle accelerator. This is a schematic of one, and what they do is put a smaller element on a target, and then they accelerate another nucleus in the cyclotron. The way they accelerate it is they release positive ions in the middle, and if you take ions and put them in an electric field, they will go around in a circle forever. You can show that in physics, but if you alternate the positive and negative between the two sides, you can make the circle get bigger and bigger, and by the time it's as big as the reactor, it is going pretty fast, and then they open a shutter and allow the accelerated particle to slam into the one on the target, and you hope you get a bigger element. The only way they detect these new elements, I have looked these up. When you make a new element, all they get is maybe 2 atoms, 4 atoms, something like that. The only way they know that the atoms were even there is that they put a detector around the target so that they can detect any radiation that comes off after the collision. These big atoms give off lots of particles before they get to be stable, and if you detect those particles coming off after the collision, you can conclude that you must have had a few atoms of the element that give off the particles. There are elements bigger than 209. We're going to talk about, or I'm sorry, bigger than Meiternum 109, but I showed the reaction they said they used to make Meiternum in a nuclear reactor. You slam together stable bismuth and stable iron, and it produced a few atoms of element 109. This is actually a complete periodic table of all the known elements that people have discovered so far. The elements up through number 118 have been discovered, and since element 118 is in the same column as noble gases, people assume that it's going to be or is a noble gas. The thing is, in order to actually test that, you would have to have enough sample in order to actually determine it. And with the larger elements, usually they just can't get enough of a sample to study the chemical properties. They just know what the element is. If you look at when these were discovered, Lawrencium 103 has been around since right after I was born. I believe they synthesized it in the early 60s, and they have determined that it actually has a positive 3 ion, just like some of the other intertransition elements. But the ones beyond 103 are up in the transition row, in the 4th row of the transition elements, and all of those are very small quantities. The world community has decided to name these after scientists. And so all of those names, like 106 is named after a man called Seaborg, Glenn Seaborg, so it's called Seaborgium. All of those elements are, and there's some of them that are place names. 116 is Livermore, who's a person, but it's also a very famous lab in California, the Livermore lab. So, and the TS 117 is actually named after the state of Tennessee, which is where the Oak Ridge National Lab is. So they use a lot of different sources to get these names. I love the number 118 because it's Og. Sounds like a caveman, doesn't it? A Georgentum or something. But anyway, this is how many elements have at present been discovered, and they have to be verified by at least 2 different labs in order to be considered discovered. But this is where we are. So I always tell people that, you know, in 131, you started out with these wimpy little elements like nitrogen and oxygen and chlorine, and then now in 132, we went through the whole top row of the transition elements in lab, and we got all the way up to like tin and lead, and we talked about bismuth. And now, on the very last day of class, we got all the way to the biggest element that exists at the present time. So in other words, you started chemistry at the beginning of the periodic table, you went all the way through, And now we got all the way to the end. So that must mean chemistry is over.